Welcome to October, my favorite and spookiest month, a month of haunted code and HTML hell. You may find yourself in Java's crypt or encountering the horror of Ruby entrails. If so, please enable automatic updates now and use only a FIDO key for MFA. After all, you wouldn't want your code editor to become ID evil. Cue the spooky laughter, which means this week we talk with Hillary Benson from GitLab about equipping developers with the tools and workflows they need to be successful at writing and building secure code. In the news segment, Apple Pay picks up a hitchhiker, the poltergeists in JavaScript prototypes, open source gets help from a ghost. A root CA expires. Static analysis takes the descent into open source, and more. Find a quiet place and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today. Contrast Security enables organizations to secure their applications from development to production. By embedding security sensors within software, Contrast automatically and continuously detects vulnerabilities in both custom and open source code while developers write code, providing them with context-specific how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast remediation. At the same time, by identifying only true vulnerabilities that pose risk and eliminating those that do not, Contrast empowers developers and security teams to prioritize and focus on only those vulnerabilities that matter. Learn how Contrast can help you secure your applications from development through production at securityweekly.com/contrast. Software supply chain attacks are continuing to expose vulnerabilities in organizations around the world. The time has come to focus your efforts on security for your software packages. Cloudsmith is the only cloud-native software package management solution for your enterprise. With Cloudsmith Continuous Packaging, you can securely deliver software across the globe and mitigate potential threats from entering your supply chain. With over 23+ formats supported, Cloudsmith is the solution that engineers choose to safely deliver all of their assets. Reduce unneeded downtime and deliver with confidence. Start securing your software supply chain today by visiting securityweekly.com/Cloudsmith.
This is episode 168, recorded October 4th, 2021. I'm your Crypt Keeper understudy, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella, who's back with us this episode. Hello, John.
Yay, Mr. Shima, how are you? I'm happy to be back.
I'm happy you're here, and happy you survived all of the Tales from the Crypt punification that I've done so far. Let's see if you can make it to the end of the episode. InfoSec World 2021 is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's event. Hear from Robert Herjavec, plus heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Plus, Security Weekly listeners save 20% on digital pass registration. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2021 to register now. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, our Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. Hillary Benson is Director of Product Management for GitLab Secure and Protect. Prior to GitLab, she served as a product executive in the container security space and led teams in building software tools and executing intelligence collection missions for the National Security Agency. Hillary lives in Los Gatos, California, with her husband and 2 Welsh corgis. Hello, Hillary. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here, and hopefully we'll maybe get a peek at the corgis later. Who knows? But the important thing is that we do want to talk about developers writing secure code and making it possible for them. And I think the current turn of phrase is developer first security, which is sort of the same idea. I think as shift left, developers become more responsible for security, which are all great phrases to use. But maybe we should tease out really what that means. So if we do start talking about what is developer first security for writing and building software, what should we have in mind as we think about this and build out the workflows to do so?
Yeah, I think there's a few things actually. So obviously the processes that your company puts in place has to sort of accommodate this developer first approach. I think one of the key things that you want to have integrated into your processes and your DevSecOps program is the idea of implementing tooling that gives developers that ability to address issues early and often. And so there are a lot of products out there, a lot of security products that will talk about surfacing issues in a way that makes it easy for developers to resolve, but often still requires security professionals to kind of be in the loop for that. And so one of the things that we at GitLab really approach from this perspective is to put those security issues into the tools that developers are already using. So for instance, in our product, you have the ability to surface introduction of vulnerabilities in the actual merge request anytime a developer is introducing new code into the project. And so it's basically focused on only the things that individual developer can control and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and keeps the scope of that limited to the code that they're actually introducing so that they can resolve those issues as they're going along rather than waiting for those issues to sort of make it to production and then get thrown back over the fence by security. And so a lot of what we're doing with our product is to kind of enable that type of workflow where you do surface those issues early and often.
Yeah, and that's definitely a common theme, both the aspects of early and often, as well as why don't we work within the context of who's writing the code and when they're potentially making mistakes or writing the insecure parts of code are sneaking in, or the insecure configurations for that matter. But that does talk a little bit that we're, I think, maybe taking some of the AppSec team a little bit out of the loop, since we're putting the tools in front of the DevOps team, giving them the context. So how much of this do we want to completely pull the AppSec team out of the loop? How much should we keep them in? Or maybe asking a different way, how do we maintain confidence that we are in fact still maintaining a good, secure software throughout this process?
Absolutely. So I think it's explicitly part of the goal to take AppSec out of certain parts of the process. And those parts of the process are parts where having a human in the loop doesn't necessarily add value, right? And so the idea here basically is to kind of codify what your security policies are and your organization's approach to your security program in policies, in your tooling, have as much of that automated as possible so that for those things where you know what your organization's policy is, you don't have to reevaluate that every single time a new vulnerability comes up or some other security policy is violated. Just have that automated and have the developer deal with that directly. I think that that's more efficient for the business, and it's also nicer for the AppSec team to not have to sit in the middle of every one of those little issues and spend your day processing vulnerability reports. I suppose there's a certain type of security professional who enjoys doing that, maybe, but I think most of us are sort of compelled to spend our time on more interesting things.
Yeah. No, I think it sounds too that we've talked about, in general, the industry talks about infrastructure as code, things like that. It's almost as if we're getting to a policy as code or standards as code. Since, as you're saying, let's automate what we can and be smart about it. So then I think there's still going to be an aspect of AppSec needing to be a part of this process, or at least getting some feedback from developers, because there's, I think, a difference between here's a tool, developers, to find all of the potential misconfiguration issues, all the potential issues that are out of policy, out of standard. But suddenly you've got every single issue that comes up, and the developers look at that and think, wow, that's a long list. Do I have to do I have to fix every single one of these? Or what's the prioritization approach? And maybe is that a smart way to bring in, the AppSec team for their advice on figuring out what are the important ones to fix and which ones could maybe be ignore or just a fix later?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the way you handle this is you have your security team sort of define Those instances in which resolving a vulnerability, for instance, is completely straightforward and the developer should just go ahead and do that right away. For instance, it's pretty easy for everyone, I think, to get on board with the idea that if you have a CVE with a CVSS score over 7, that you should resolve that rather than introducing that in production. But if you have kind of more subtle, more subtle vulnerabilities that may or may not be that big of a problem, maybe you let those things go and you sort of codify that in your tools and in your security policies, so it's very clear for the developer, this thing needs to be remediated right now, and this other thing can wait until later. And then you go ahead and you provide the visibility of those issues that remain and do make their way to production to the security team, so that they can monitor what's happening with whatever that application ends up being in production, and be able to say, okay, now this issue that we didn't resolve previously appears to be problematic for whatever reason. There's some indication that someone's trying to take advantage of the application or what have you. And then you can go and prioritize that issue. And so you still have the AppSec team in the loop here in multiple ways. They're setting the policy for what is a security issue, setting the policy for what needs to be remediated immediately, and then still monitoring all of your applications in production. And still, some of those issues will move all the way to the end, and they're at the end of the pipeline, and they're running in production, and they'll have to go back and resolve those issues later. So there's definitely still a substantial role for the AppSec team at every stage of the process.
So I know GitLab, you guys really you drink your Kool-Aid. How has this worked for you guys? It's as the company has grown and become this. I think you either are public or you're about to go public. I can't remember. But as you become like a mature company, how has this sort of affected what's going on within the company, or what have you seen?
Yeah, dogfooding is a big aspect for GitLab. We do this all day, every day. GitLab using GitLab, and so we implement our own tools. Our developers use our security approvals, for instance, to determine what things they need to remediate immediately. There's challenges for GitLab, just like there are for any company. Actually getting to that process where you have really healthy hygiene and you're actually resolving these issues on a regular basis is not simple, even for a company who espouses that and says this is how we should be doing security. Mm-hmm. It's definitely a challenge, but that also means that as we're going through these things and realizing what those practical challenges are, we're implementing things in our tools that make that easier for developers and for security teams.
Cool.
Part of that, I'm curious too, is what does it look like? What does it look like to measure this, or to get that sense of? I asked earlier, sort of that idea: how much confidence can we have that our code is secure? But you're describing a lot of practices that internally that your own teams are doing to deal with vulns. Watch, some of them may get into prod, some of them are below a threshold of cats knocking things over off my shelf. Sorry for the noise. So I'm taking us here in sort of that direction of metrics, and so maybe let's start with internally. What are some of the things that you look at with your teams internally, just to say we're building secure code? This is actually safe to ship or good to ship now.
Yeah, you can look at a variety of things. So I think some of the things that we would look at are similar to what any organization would look at, like number of vulnerabilities that are being introduced into the code on any given day, mean time to remediation, these sorts of things. And then we track those things over time. Actually, I can go ahead and kind of share out my screen here and give you sort of an example of some of the things that we look at. Hopefully you're seeing my screen now. So for instance, in terms of things that you would look at on a day-to-day basis, the developer, as they're introducing code into their project, can take a look at, for this, this individual code change that you're making, what are the security issues that I'm introducing and where are those things coming from? So what I'm showing right now on the screen is basically a merge request in GitLab that shows this code change that you made. You're introducing something with too critical and too high and 20 other vulnerabilities, and then you can look at, okay, what exactly is causing those issues to be introduced. And so on the individual developer level, you can be tracking these things very closely, all the way up to, if you take a look at our vulnerability reports, this is something I'm showing right now, a vulnerability report in GitLab. And this is something that the security team, the AppSec team, would be able to look at and say, okay, for all of the issues that existed in this project, all the different things that developers have introduced, where are we at? And you can track things like how many of these have open merge requests that are actually resolving these issues, how many have issues created. And so you have visibility in GitLab basically from the first step of a developer introducing a vulnerability at the individual level, all the way to the AppSec team being able to monitor that sort of on a broader scale.
I think one of the things is also that maybe is a little more subtle that you need to see that screenshot to appreciate is that there were multiple sources of those issues coming in. We saw DAST, SAS, container and scanning, and I think dependency scanning as well. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is that I'm pretty sure the developers don't really care necessarily what that source was, other than was this something I need to fix? Or as you pointed out, was it critical or high or something like that? So that also seems like just that smart abstraction when we talk about developer first security to make them continue to be experts on fixing code and writing code rather than experts on running tools and understanding the nuances of SAST versus SCA or things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, as a security professional, you can spend your entire career in security and still learn something new every single day. And so the idea that you need to find ways to give developers the right amount of education so that they're enabled is you're definitely sort of dancing on a fine line with that. And so what we try to do is provide information that gives a developer sort of a sense for security and where different issues come from. And just the way that we organize the merge request, for instance, is an example. You have the vulnerability there, and that's really what the developer cares about, but you sort of also can see where it comes from. And so if you have an interest as a developer to learn about these different aspects of security, you can go and do that and say, well, what is DAST? I don't even know what that is as a developer. And they can go and teach themselves. Some of the other things that we're looking at with this is providing education, for instance, for the developer right in that merge request, again, giving them the ability to learn just the right amount of information at the right moment. So say, for instance, if you're a developer and you're introducing, a SQL injection vulnerability into your code, if you don't know what that is, you might provide some educational training that is just about SQL injection and how the way that you write code causes those issues. And so by doing that, you're keeping the security education that you're giving your developers extremely focused on things that are very related to the work that they're actually doing, and not requiring them to go and learn a bunch of stuff that may or may not be relevant to them, or may require a lot of investment in gaining security knowledge that maybe they don't need actually.
So Hillary, let's see if this one goes somewhere interesting, Mike. One thing, and that this is not a gotcha. This is you guys think a lot about this type of thing, so I think it could be interesting to see what your thoughts are on it. Over the last week or so, I've been thinking about different branching models, Git flow versus trunk, and things like this, from the point of view of what actually provides a smoother, more efficient development process for that end developer, right? Because we're trying to make their life easy, and we want things to be secure, but at the same time we're trying to stay out of their way. And I like Git flow because I'm able to have that a little more control over what a pull request looks like and how you do the review of it and all those type of things. But the thought from you, we're just talking about metrics. You've said here a few times you've been thinking about having just the right amount of information, not going too far. Has GitLab thought about, or are you guys doing anything around gathering metrics around how much is security, quote unquote, slowing down the development process?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting concept. In terms of slowing down, do you mean this like X amount of times we stop the pipeline because of a security issue, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it could be that, or just like, the distraction, or from compared to a pure, develop. Oh, 5 years later, we figure out we had a bug. So not so much, I'm not so much thinking about the fixing early versus fixing late, but like as we add anything into that workflow, super valuable, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it's going to have some effect. I'm just wondering if any customers have pushed back on that, or if that's something GitLab's thought about internally, or anything around that sort of metric idea.
Sure, gotcha. Yeah, so I think the way that GitLab implements this, all of our security functionality, all of our security scans work as CI pipeline jobs. And so what you can look at here is, as these things are running on each commit, you can take a look at, okay, based on my existing security policy that I've implemented, how many times have I failed a pipeline based on some security finding? How much time are we costing the developer by doing that? And you can adjust. You can decide, to not fail anything in your pipeline based on a security issue. You can have a really high bar if you want to, and you can kind of tune that and take a look at those metrics over time. So that's something very tactical, I think, in terms of slowing things down or speeding things up. You can also, I think, giving some attention to, as you're tracking kind of mean time to remediation, I think that speaks to speed as well, which it's sort of in a reverse kind of backwards way almost, in the sense that if you actually have very short remediation times, that kind of means that you're not wasting a bunch of time after you push something to production to get that issue back to the developer. So the faster that your MTTR is, the less time that you're spending across your entire crew that's involved in your software development lifecycle, because you are resolving those issues early. And so I think those are the two main things that I would point to.
Cool. I think that brings up a tangent for me, I think, as well, because we're talking about some of the what time gets added to the deployments by tapping in and adding these different tools. It takes time to run that SCA tool, that SAS tool, et cetera. But that also kind of means we're tapping into the CI/CD pipeline and potentially growing its attack surface. So I'm curious if you have some advice or some lessons learned that you all discovered as you were incorporating all of these into a very nice front end for developers to consume, but ways to make sure that build pipeline still maintains security and all these additional tools haven't made it a little bit weaker, because regardless of using GitLab or not, that's definitely going to be a concern for any organization out there about how restrictive do we make our build environment versus open it up to tools to easier integration with for access for developers.
Sure. So I think there's a couple things there in relation to kind of the attack surface. It just sort of depends. If you're already using these tools or you're planning on using them, any kind of, like for instance, a SAS or DAS scanner, that attack surface still exists somewhere, right, in your environment. And so whether that is somewhere random, that the security team is managing, or if it's in your CI/CD pipeline, you still have to reckon with it. And so GitLab kind of prides itself on our ability to integrate with basically whatever security tooling you're using, so you can continue to use those tools and use us for some things, and use other tools for special purpose jobs if you want to. But we, of course, always recommend that folks use as much of our tooling as they possibly can. There's various reasons for that. Security is one of them. We pay very close attention to how we are developing our tools and ensuring that code is secure. And so that's part of it. And then I think that it's also, sorry, what was the second part of your question? It was in relation to sort of attack surface. And then what was the second part? Sorry, Mike.
I think I may have forgotten myself as well. It really was about that attack surface, or just that idea of keeping an eye on the integration, or even potentially if there are lessons learned about from that direction of, here is how pause for a moment, because one of the reasons I'm asking this is you were mentioning too, security education for developers. I'm curious if there's been a other direction of that type of education, as the AppSec team is getting some development education. Is there understanding smarter or better ways to integrate these types of tools so that as you're describing, it can be done securely? Yeah.
I do think that there is a meshing of sorts, especially with kind of the advent and popularization of DevSecOps. There's this meshing together of the developer and security professionals, roles and responsibilities. And so I think you have more of the traditional security responsibilities, moving left into the developer's scope. And then you have a lot of things like security automation and actually building tooling sort of seeping over into the more traditional security roles. And I think you'll continue to see that over time. It'll become more and more important for that relationship between development and security, and for the tools and approaches that they're using to become more intertwined. So I think that is an aspect of it.
That makes sense. And I think that leads to another angle of a question I'm curious about, is sort of what can the AppSec side of the house and the DevOps or DevSecOps side be striving for? And here my thoughts are more of going back to earlier on when you're describing a lot of what AppSec is doing we should probably stop. It's either boring or, more importantly, it's not adding value. So maybe pick one of those two sides to start with, AppSec or DevOps. And what do you think, either call it sort of the future holds, or what should they be striving for in terms of kind of defining roles or a charter for their team, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really does go back to what I was saying earlier about where the role should sit, and where the AppSec team can really add value. And so I think what you do there is you try and move as many of the things that your AppSec team is doing that are very procedural, that are very sort of administrative almost in nature, gathering vulnerabilities from somewhere, putting it in a report, pushing that back to the development team. Anytime that you're applying sort of constant logic, it doesn't really require any kind of analysis of what's going on. All of those things, to the greatest extent possible, you should try and automate in one way or another. And GitLab, of course, is a tool that can help you do that with security policies and with all of our security scanning tools. But there's lots of ways to do that, of course. And so as far as what you're doing with your security team, it's really evaluating how many processes do we have in place, how many activities are my AppSec team involved in that really require a human to sit and analyze something versus is this something that I can automate away? And then, the AppSec team can spend time on things that are, quite frankly, more interesting, right? More time on security testing and red teaming and coming up with new policies, looking at trending across what's going on at your company, focusing more on initiatives than individual issues. For instance, your AppSec team can be watching trends to see, common problems that are popping up across your company. It's common. I'll go back to the SQL injection, vulnerability example that I used earlier. Say you're seeing this not just in a one-off in an individual team, individual project, but you're seeing a lot of your developers across the company introducing SQL injection vulnerabilities. Maybe that's an opportunity to start up a kind of initiative, educational initiative, to say, here's what this is about. We see this going on frequently. Here's how you resolve these issues, and focus on things more proactively. So really analyzing what's going on with your security program, analyzing what's happening with security risk in production, and spending your time and attention on those things rather than on the sort of procedural things that are really, quite frankly, low-hanging fruit that you can automate away for the most part.
Yeah, absolutely. To use the phrase of the day, that makes sense. But I'm going to add too that it makes sense, and you're talking with us, so I think that you have some support from leadership about the philosophy behind this, about moving AppSec and DevOps teams towards this. What do you have advice for other organizations that are trying to do perhaps this type of transformation? Because I imagine it's going to be a little bit more difficult than just the AppSec team saying, we're going to stop looking for XSS and we're going to do something different, or we're going to replace. It can also be scary to hear we're going to replace the AppSec team with tools, because that doesn't. I know that's not what you're saying, but that could be something that people maybe mishear. So, what is the leadership aspect here? Or how do you get maybe buy-in to convince an org or something to point to where you can say these are the foundational changes we want to make in how we approach the building software, not let alone building software securely?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think especially this comes up a lot in the context of companies wanting to start up a DevSecOps program or operate more in a DevSecOps kind of format. And I think first and foremost, you have to make sure that your leadership team is really on the same page about why they're looking to do that and what your goals are. Because DevSecOps means something different to everyone you talk to. And so yes. I think a lot of that is because every company is different, right? And so you need different things at different companies. And so first and foremost, you need to have your leadership team really on the same page that we have ABC challenges. And as a result, we want to address that by implementing a DevSecOps program, and then need to discuss, okay, what are the processes that we're trying to put in place to achieve a DevSecOps program? What do we want that to look like? And then say, okay, what tools will help us achieve those goals? And so I think anytime you try to implement a cross-functional, cross-company initiative or program, like something like DevSecOps, which is fundamentally built on the idea that you have organizations across your company working very closely and collaboratively, you need to have that be a top-down initiative. You need to make sure that everybody is on the same page and marching in the same direction. Otherwise, do more from the
Yeah, it sounds the other part of this is that there's an important component here beyond just the technical aspects of what are the OWASP top 10, what is the OWASP ASVS, because you're describing quite a bit of communications, communicating the problem effectively to leadership. You're talking about a lot of interesting collaboration building between teams. And really, I just wanted, I think there's a question here somewhere, but mostly I just wanted to highlight that as I like how you're calling attention to that as important skills for AppSec teams to consider, to build out, so that because that I think is a key part of what this future type of deployment model, or development model looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think DevSecOps at the end of the day is as much about culture as it is about tooling. And so it's very important for your organizational culture and your leaders to kind of reflect the desire and the sort of values to go and implement a program like this.
No, I think so. I'm curious as we start to wrap up here. I'm curious. You've given us quite a bit to reflect on as well about choosing tools, working with DevOps. Is there a culture that you'd like to see continue to emerge, or is there particular aspects of that culture that you'd really like to encourage teams to lean into and build out good, healthy software teams rather than just the software itself? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that my opinions here sort of reflect my own thoughts on what DevSecOps is all about. So I'll just throw that out there. But I think the sort of collaborative attitude and the idea around making sure that you're doing everything you can to make things as efficient as possible for everyone involved in the process, right? And so I think a lot of times, it's sort of scary to say, okay, I'm going to go and educate somebody else and train them how to do ABC, XYZ, because those are things that I typically do. And so if I go and train someone else to do this, what's going to happen to my job? I think that's a common feeling for security professionals. And I know I kind of experienced that myself back in the day when I was still in the security industry. But I think that everyone can sort of reflect on what they spend their days doing, folks that are in security, and see that you spend so much time, you're so overwhelmed all the time. I don't know a single security professional who says, I don't have enough to do. So if you really try to work with folks and collaborate to say, okay, what makes sense? What's most efficient for the developer to take? What's most efficient for me to focus on as a security professional? What makes the most sense for your DevOps teams? Like the folks are actually, managing your infrastructure, and really look at that collaboratively and look at the mission that your company is trying to achieve and what's best for the team and the company. And those sorts of things are sort of where you need to start. I think there's a lot there around communication and transparency. And, I could spend all day elaborating on GitLab values. I think the short of my answer is go read our page on GitLab values, and you'll see what I think you need to do in order to implement sort of a healthy working culture. And I think at the end of the day, that overall healthy working culture is kind of what you need in order to be successful in building a successful DevSecOps program as well.
I think that's a wonderful message. And as predicted, we've also run out of time, even though we have tons more I think we could talk about. So I want to say thank you, Hillary, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mike.
It was a great conversation. If you'd like to learn more about GitLab, visit securityweekly.com/GitLab. Also want to thank all of our listeners. Thank John as well. We're going to take a quick break and reanimate with news of the week.
We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop form jacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva. In any business today, there comes a moment, the moment you realize you can secure the code as fast as you write it. Instead of testing everything, you can just test the right things. It's not about tools, but intelligent risk management. That's the moment you choose Synopsys. Build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsis. Is your mobile app really secure? New vulnerabilities pop up every day, and malicious actors look for easy targets on app marketplaces to exploit. Securing your app's valuable IP and data is critical. GuardSquare's security solutions are built for developers and protect your app at every stage in the development lifecycle. Multiple layers of protection prevent reverse engineering and automatically detect tampering, making your app a difficult target for attackers. Learn more at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We'll have keynotes from Melissa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and check out our exciting lineup. Also, join us October 21st to learn why zero-knowledge encryption matters. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And this, Mr. Kinsella, brings us to the news. Glad to have you back again with us to talk about all things news. I don't think we have too much on the Microsoft side of things, so hopefully we'll protect your brain a bit. But we might as well start off with two articles about Apple. I've got one and you've got one, but you've got one about cross-site scripting. So tell us what cool and complex and highly sophisticated cross-site scripting vulnerability has been discovered.
Oh, man. I think the folks down in Cupertino decided to try and play catch up with the folks in Redmond. I don't know. Maybe the planets aligned. So this one's. So there's three actually. I decided not to put in the third. I only wanted to cause so much focus on a particular single vendor. But so this one is interesting. We talked previously about Apple AirTags came out earlier this year. Seemed like neat things. My friends seem to be really into them. But the way the AirTag works, and this goes for anything, right? The nice thing about this particular vulnerability is it's a learning example for all sorts of folks. So with the AirTag, if it is, you have the ability to put it into lost or missing mode. So if someone else finds it and they bring their phone to it, it will pop up. I can't remember the exact details, but the idea is it'll say, hey, this is the person's phone number, or click on this link to go over to the Apple site and find out how to contact them. So it turns out that field is whatever a user puts in, and there's no sanitization, or at least decent filtering, and everyone knows where I'm going with this. So you bring that up on someone's phone, they click on the link to go where we're supposed to be able to go, and there's now the ability to do either credential hijacking or redirection or any of the fun games we've been doing with cross-site scripting for about the last 10, 15 years now. So, it seems like they didn't think about it at all. They just put a field there where someone could put a value into it and they said, hey, Bob's your uncle. And now we've got all those things floating around out there, and hopefully you're not going to be able to fix it easily on the AirTag side of things. Maybe you can do a firmware update, I guess, possibly, but it would be quite simple for them to update found.apple.com to do some filtering after the fact on the rendering side. And as of the last time I heard about this, the story is about a week old. They haven't started doing that yet, so maybe they'll sort of catch up a little bit. But that's our first one for today. Let's see if we can go uphill or downhill from there.
And I thought, I was going into this thinking, there would be something clever and cool, and it was just a script tag and a phone number. It's kudos to the research to discover it, but that does seem a little bit of that's a dead simple is my term of art for that, and just going to have to shake my head. Of just being frustrated, I'll say, to see those types of vulns still be apparent and present.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, I think most that's one of the problems with this is I bet most of our listeners can guess how to fix this right now. But we want to try and keep this educational. We're not here for entertainment. We're not here just to bitch at vendors.
Right.
But that's a fairly simple thing for someone to go through on either side. Like I just said, you can either, when you're taking that input from the user, Let's filter and sanitize, or at least to return an error message then saying, hey, you can't use those characters. As that's not as easy to do as it sounds, but you can do that. Or on the reverse side, escape and encode everything left and right possible, so that even if someone has the best cross-site scripting example in there, still make sure that what you're actually rendering back out on that API call, not the browser, but on the API call, is fairly sanitized. So that's why we are starting our segment here with so many eye rolls. So as I said, we'll see what we go from here.
We see where we can go, but we will do a callback to the opening segment of October. And when I was recommending FIDO only for your MFA, because in this case, there's the vulnerability and then there's the exploit. The exploit in this particular article was calling attention to credential theft. But if you have multi-factor authentication enabled for your iCloud account, yes, it's going to be bad, I will agree, to lose your credentials, especially if you've made the mistake of reusing them elsewhere, for example, in your email account. But if you have multi-factor authentication enabled, you probably, or you very should be strongly protected against that particular type of attack. So it's still something that should be fixed, but you as the end user can still also protect yourself from the faults of software. And that's a general comment. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is talking about what can be done on the exploit side of vulnerabilities, because I think that's a segue into this other article that I picked out about Apple Pay Express Transit. And here some researchers had a pretty neat research article. There's a PDF linked to in the show notes that basically says they can spoof what a transit terminal looks like, and then collect payments from a iPhone. Now, the article I linked to is a pretty concise threat model summary of that. I think I pretty strongly agree with, at least for the moment. We'll see what John does to convince me of what the issue is. Basically, there is a usability, a user experience design in this particular feature. You don't want to slow people down as they're trying to exit from transit stations, especially in the underground, in the London Underground. It gets pretty crowded as is. So the design choice was you don't need to unlock in order to pay for transit, because that unlock step, you either have to hold it up to your face or do something else that's going to slow things down. So that's one setup right there. So I'm going through the business context of a bit of why the design is like this. But then there is this attack, which the researchers figured out. They say, I can be a transit terminal, and I'm going to charge $1,000 transaction to this locked iPhone and collect money. What then the counter to that is to say that vulnerability may exist, but payments can be a complex system, or I should say payments are a complex system. And in this case, Visa is making the statement, making the assertion that they have other controls that would make it either very hard to successfully get the money out of this type of transaction. So you could execute transactions, but you may not be able to get your hands on the cash as the outcome of it. And they're also saying that the user may be inconvenienced by this. Obviously, it's not going to be happy to lose £1,000, but they're not going to be. They'll be refunded with that. So that was my probably longer description than the article is to set up the threat model and figure out how much should we worry about this, how much should we fix this, or do we have mitigating controls that we might rely on? So that's where I'm going to set up, and let's see what John can do to tear it apart in an educational way.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you did a pretty good job there. I was just sort of browsing the article while you're talking, and yeah, so that it's an interesting. It's sort of, as far as Visa is concerned, it's funny money, right? At this point, because we're staying within their little pool until someone manages to not either one way or another transfer that to either another Visa account. I don't think you can do Visa transfers, but either until they get that out of Visa system to a bank account, it's funny money. So they don't care what happens. They can reverse that charge quite easily. So that's interesting. I think I'd want to see like maybe GPS coordinates around it to try and minimize, because I could see, me having the way I think, have a backpack with a fake terminal and just walk down the aisle of a train, especially during crowded time. Like think like the Japanese trains, right? You could sort of just run right through there. But so that I could see doing the bypass attacks, the walk by attacks. that being interesting. But yeah, I mean, Visa's had for ages this ability, or not ability, their what's the phrase they use here? Sorry, I just used their phrase, zero liability policy. In other words, up to a certain limit, I think they're saying here, I think $1,000. No, it's here, £1,000. So within that, they'll cover for that. So I think you're mitigating a security issue with a monetary policy, which is interesting. You're big enough and you own that system, you own that network. So it's when you own network. So I think that's okay. I guess let's look at it from the opposite direction. Could you say that your iPhone actually wasn't tagging on a real turnstile and that someone was tampering with your phone and those charges aren't from you? That'd be interesting. I'm not sure if the value is large enough there, and there's probably a good amount of human work to do that, and they'll make it sort of painful for you. So it's an interesting way to deal with it. I'd rather see some sort of crypto on that contact process and actually have that bit signed a little bit better. But not horrible.
No, not horrible. And I think, and I like where you're going. To be clear, the crypto was cryptography there.
Yes.
And I think it's sort of like we were just talking about cross-site scripting in the other article, and there's reflected cross-site scripting and there's stored cross-site scripting, which could be a bit more consequential as demonstrating credential theft. Still bugs to address. And you suggested some interesting ideas here too about ways to harden this process and build better attestation between the terminal and the iPhone around this. But yeah, I think it's a good type of item to bring up, because I think threat modeling isn't always so stark that here is the vuln to fix, go forth and fix it. And I think that's one of the other reasons I wanted to bring up this article, is to get the AppSec teams, AppSec mentality out of the idea that everything must be fixed now. Let's add some business context. Let's talk about how do we figure out how to get to that prioritization to say, development team, this is something that needs to be fixed in the next sprint versus this is something that maybe needs to be fixed in the next quarter or even next year for that matter. So that's one of my ulterior motives. On ulterior motives, another one is to figure out, do I care about vulns? So prototype pollution, I've heard about this for quite a while, not because I'm smart, just because I'm paying attention to Black Hat conferences, for example. And I think we've seen the array prototype be manipulated by Jeremiah Grossman at least 10 years ago, if not longer than that. And it's always been a pretty clever and interesting vulnerability to me, because it's taking advantage of some really fundamental ways that JavaScript works. And in this article, the researchers had some great links to examples of consequential prototype pollution vulnerabilities as well as a good walkthrough of how they pulled off some additional research to find, I think, 18 vulnerable libraries and 80 or so vulns, as well as collecting quite a bit of bug bounties along the way. But here's an example that if we're talking about threat models, I kind of want to come around to the idea of, why does this design pattern of turning your URL parameters into basically a JavaScript object exist? This seems like a capability that's possible and kind of a fun thing to work all within JavaScript, but it doesn't seem like a compelling solution to any particular use case, because it's introducing this type of vulnerability with the way protos and object inheritance works within JavaScript, all for the sake of, here's a key value pair coming out of our URL or coming out of a payload. So that's my that's my thought of it, is why do we have this design in the first place? John, what do you think about this?
Ease, right? A lot of this comes down to ease. So I haven't looked at this as nearly as closely as I want to. And one thing I wish they had said, they do. Okay. I was going to say, I wish they had said up front, I was like, when I was first scanning through this, I'm like, they're talking about JavaScript prototypes, right? And yes, they are. This looks like a good read. It's fairly long, and lots of researchers are taking part of it, and unfortunately, I just didn't have the time. But familiar with the concept, and I think sort of bringing it back around to what you were just asking. The next article I have in here will sort of foreshadow on that. But like, what's a developer trying to do, right? I mean, I'm running into this a tiny bit in Go. So in Go, you also have the ability to It's more just purely like manifestation of a string into a JSON string, say, for example, into a structure. And why do you do that, right? It is because I'm using a library. I mean, in this case, it's built into the language, but you're using something so that I don't have to go and parse the JSON and go, okay, well, let's see, I've got quotes here, and I got a colon, and I got another value, and it's a quote, and then a comma. And instead of doing all that type of thing, not just being able to just quickly manifest that into some sort of object, but actually into the object which I'm using internally. There's, at least on the Go side, there's value behind it because I know what that structure is internally and I can control it. So if someone tries to put a value in which is not within those particular parameters which I'm expecting, I shouldn't say parameters, that's going to confuse, within that structure which I'm using, it'll either error out or something's going to happen. It's not going to work, right? If they add another value which is in a different field, it's just going to be ignored. So it's nice from that point of view, and it's relatively clean. That's not all the validation we're doing, but that's a pretty good chunk of it. But in this case, yeah, it's that same type of thing. Is you're getting going. You want to have, like, you see always the examples of Amazon's pretty horrible about this right now. Of the example, at least that's what the one I'm seeing. All their examples are for like the easy use case, right? So I want to start a Lambda function and I want to be able to parse the first 2 or 3 parameters. Well, okay, here you go, sir. Here's, you proxy in your request through an API gateway. It's going to come in as a some sort of a Lambda request. I'm going to hand it over to this particular item, which is going to consider a prototype and take the parameters and put them into it. And it's easy, we'll get the website up and going in 5-10 minutes. And that sounds very attractive to any of us at first when we're starting to get going with this stuff. Until then you look at it a little bit closer, you're like, oh, that was the basic example. Well, I want to do something more advanced. Where's the example for that? Oh, it doesn't exist. Okay, Stack Overflow, where else do I go? And I think that's a decent chunk of it. Is like, how do you get going? How do you bootstrap up in these things, which, we go to college hopefully to learn how to learn, not so much to learn how to program in Pascal or Fortran or whatever language we use whenever we're there.
Right.
But how do you actually run with these things? So I think I suspect that's a large chunk of this type of thing. And, everyone knows our thoughts on JavaScript. It'd be interesting to see what happens with this type of stuff. Yeah, no mention of TypeScript. It'd be interesting to see what happens with this with TypeScript. And I guess TypeScript is going to, it's going to render down to JavaScript anyways, so, or compile down. I don't want to get the word people coming after me. It's going to compile down to JavaScript, but still, yeah.
It does. And I think, I was peeking at, the latest ECMA script, to be super clear about what we're looking at too. The ECMA script standard to see what it's talking about, freezing an object and things like that. But I think fundamentally my philosophy is coming around to, I don't object to the marshalling and unmarshalling of URL parameters into an object. For example, protobufs are actually really good about this. They can be pretty complex, but they have some good security features built in. Whereas doing this with JavaScript objects, there's a lot more potential to make mistakes, and that's more of what I'm objecting to, is that we're sort of misusing something that is going to make things potentially worse, harder to secure. At least it's not XML, so I will give them that, but it's not JavaScript. But I think, John, you were also saying, you were alluding to another article that you had captured for this week that I also think turns us from, once again, talking about vulns onto the developer's perspective, or what can we do, what can we think about to make software more secure. And we're starting off with the premise, which I think is really good, that we really want to highlight, is that maybe, not even maybe, it's developers do care about security. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is not a new article, older one. I've been doing a little bit of navel gazing and head scratching over the last week for a few different things. But one of the ones, this is from 2019, 13 things developers do, 13 things that keep us motivated as software developers, right? And go back and think when you're starry-eyed and, starting your career, or maybe some of you still are starting your career, and like what actually excites you? What are you trying to do? Changing the world is great, and like a lot of us like that, and money's great, and a lot of us like that. But really, what keeps us going day in, day out? So it's a list of 13 things. And some of them are really basic. I think I don't think this list is going to all apply to a single person, which is what is sort of cool about it. I got number one. I'm not sure if this is order, but number one is creating something, which I know, to me, that's hugely resonates, right? Like actually creating something from nothing. I'm a startup guy, right? I mean, I've been doing this for a decade. Creating a product from nothing and actually seeing that thing materialize, super cool. Making a work of art, some days I'll let myself do that, some days no. Learning new stuff, right? I've had guys working for me in the past and like, I love you. I want you to stay working for me. How can I keep you happy? And I've multiple people who worked with me have been like, John, as long as we're learning something and actually doing something new and interesting, we're here. Which is, as a manager, it's cool to hear as long as I can give them new and interesting and cool stuff. But it was always interesting to hear that. Challenges, we don't like doing the same old boring thing, a lot of us, getting things done. I mean, I think in a way you could sort of put this together, this list. And it's a bit of a, how would I say, sort of a psychological model of, to a degree of developer. I don't want to sort of box someone in quite that much, but improving your self-worth, we talked about that one, being in a position of influence. Okay, if you want to be a team leader, something cool, great. Like I said, these don't always apply to everyone. Belief in your product, again, okay, cool, great. I mean, yeah, if you don't believe in your product, you're probably not going to be at the company very long. For many things. The money, we talked about that. Fancy coffee machine, fear of getting fired. Oh man, if you're doing it for that reason, get the resume updated. Being respected by your fellow team members and manager, that's always nice. Working with awesome people, that's cool. So it's an interesting list, right? But nothing in there we didn't talk about. I mean, the closest we got to talking about tech was number, two, three? Number two, learning new stuff and making, well, let's say 2 and 3, learning new stuff and making a work of art. So that's interesting. I had this list of 13 things. How many of those do you get asked about in an interview? How many of those do we talk about, or pretty much any Security Weekly podcast talk about, right? There's so many of these things going on that are actually driving people to do what they do that are, security is sort of an afterthought. Let's be honest, unfortunately. So once we know that, this is why a lot of my thought process goes into now, like once we know that security isn't our core focus, how can we make things easy enough that people can either embrace security along the way or it doesn't annoy them? Or as I was asking Hillary, how much does this go slow down our users? So that's sort of the, do we have to listen to 10 more hours of the John and Mike show to figure out how to secure this stupid AirTag so that's, how do we get things done how do we take the psychological ideas behind why people are here and fit into that is something of importance to me.
It is important, and it speaks to the idea of just understanding behavior and understanding incentives as well. Because just to start out of the gate, if we're framing the conversation as developers don't care about security, we're already assuming their own mental state, and we're putting a fault on them. If instead we're figuring out what motivates you to write software, are you writing something like some beautiful code, that sort of work of art as you're describing, I think on number 3, or just learning something new. There's learning something new as an aspect of switching your front end or back end from perhaps JavaScript and NPMs over to Golang, and maybe using protobufs rather than JavaScript objects, and avoiding prototype pollution in the first place. Or, and this is where I wanted to tie it into a couple other articles from this week, or are you incentivized or supported in what you're able to do? And one of the articles that I pulled out was Google, their Google Open Source Security Team, which has a wonderful acronym of GHOST. But they were investing into the Linux Foundation to fund hardening. So last couple of episodes, I think we've been focusing quite a bit on more bug bounty. Here's another bug bounty. Here's another bunch of companies with some deep pockets funding more bug bounty awards for open source software, which is great because that research should be awarded to find vulnerabilities. But fundamentally, I think a lot of these developers know that their software has issues out there, or their software could benefit from a re-architecture, or as the Linux Foundation is focusing here, and the sos.dev, which great URL, they're focusing on what can we do to harden the build process, go through a couple different steps of code review, branch protection, a lot of things I think that you were kind of alluding to, John, in our last segment with Hillary as well. And they're, rather than just saying the old school type of AppSec approach, here's the list, go do these 12 or 13 things, come back and let us know when you're done. Not very collaborative. Instead, they're saying, we're going to finance you. We're going to help you do this. Here's a list of 10 or 12 things that have pretty clear actions that we also believe make a process more mature and improve the security. And so rather than just tell you what you should do and walk away, we're going to work with you on it. So that's why I wanted to highlight this, because I think it ties into a lot of what you were describing there in your other article as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's been it's funny that the way you're framing it is much more interesting than it sounded in my head for the last week or two when we've talked about this, or we've seen some of these things. Because unfortunately right now, just think of I'm going to talk about the other guys a little bit almost, but think about the time mark we've had over the last year or two of going from like, oh my God, the single company is going to spend $1 billion on security, to coming around to seeing these guys now say, hey, 10B, and I think it was 100 or 500 mil for external. I don't have the link in front of me. There it is. 100 million for a third party. Well, that's a nice chunk of cash. But I think it's not so much, and this comes back to exactly my thought process of, which is, it's one thing you're saying you're going to spend a bunch of cash on it, but what are you actually doing? Are you giving, copies of Microsoft Windows at list price, or are you doing something interesting? And so that support is probably almost more valuable than the cash itself, right? So one of the things we're doing at CNCF on the Security Technical Access group is we're trying to figure out, can we do something called a Security PAL, which I'm sort of leading, and try to figure out how do we go out to open source teams and, hi, I'm from security, I'm here to help. But I don't want to scare or offset or set deadlines or bug that group. But at the same time, I want to say, hey, if you got questions either about CNCF or security or how do we get you guys graduated, there's a bunch of us here that are happy to talk to you and walk you through some of those things. If you have questions or you don't know what a CVSS score is or all these different types of things, how can we help you? So that's super valuable and super useful. Because again, like I said, think about average open source team and those 13 points I just talked about. Those 13 points are for someone why they get into software, not even why they get into open source. I can tell you, right, that's really more of a pure love of the heart for those who aren't doing as part of the day job. So having someone who can come in from this side, like they're attempting to do here, I think is super cool. So that's great. More power to them.
Very cool. And I think there's also, you're highlighting some great aspects of just that basic education. We do, on the shows here, we'll throw around CVSS, CWE, CVE, et cetera. No need to explain what they are. But once you start talking to developers, their eyes can glaze over, because also how much should they really care about that versus, here is a cross-site scripting that impacts users of our AirTags in this manner, and we actually really care about credential theft, and so this is why. Here's some ways to counter it, versus, this is a CVSS, a 9.8 on the CVSV3 scale, and you should fix it within 1.7 days because the industry average, and hopefully everybody's eyes are glazing over, despite my excellent voice acting right there. Yes. But that I think is, I'm just really trying to strengthen that point you're making, and maybe pull in some other articles here about process. We were just talking about, you're talking about motivation. I was talking a little bit about process in the open source, and there's also tools. Here's an open source tool from Facebook for a SaaS tool for Android and Java, basically. Yep. And now this is, again, I've seen a lot of static analysis tools come out open source from Facebook. They've got one called PIF, P-F-F-F-F, lots of F's in there. There was also Infer, and now Mariana Trench. And to me, I'd highlight less about that there's yet another tool, and more about maybe the motivation behind the tool, or maybe the fact that you don't necessarily have the same issues that Facebook does in terms of at scale, to use the cliche. But what's always interesting is looking at what problems they're solving, because those problems are probably consequential throughout the industry. And so here's a SaaS tool that can possibly help with Android. So let me pause there and just throw it over to you, John.
Yeah, excuse my sniggering. They Sam, one of our internals at Security Weekly, I'm sure she's got a better title, so my apologies, Sam. But she was mentioning that Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram are all down right now as we talk about this. And my response was good fucking riddance. Pardon my French. But yeah, no, so I mean, again, great to see anything from Facebook, right? I mean, let's just address the elephant in the room, right? We know that the public questionable things going on with that group, but they've got a great security team. They've had great security people go through this. And so it's cool to see their tools are really, most of the stuff that's come out of, I mean, if you think about actually what we do on a day in, day out basis, a lot of the better open source tools which we use are coming from Facebook. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. This is an interesting one. I know there's still a ton of people doing JavaScript. So, Java. One day I'll be able to say that about JavaScript too. So yeah, it's valuable, and I'm glad to see them bringing something like that out there, and it can help us. I want to go back to the previous one for 2 seconds, the Google article. Folks should go and hit up that blog, because one thing I forgot to mention is there's a bunch of good links out of it to other places. Like we talked about SOS, but also like they mentioned at least 2 different groups, both core infrastructure as well as OSSF, Open Source Software Foundation, I think it is.
Security Foundation.
Both have algorithms now around how to come up with, how do you prioritize and scale the importance of an open source package which you're using from the point of view of security. So how do you figure out the criticality of a package in your stack? And I think that's probably being we should probably cover that to a separate 20, 30 minutes, right? We should come back to that another week. But anyways, yeah, the JavaScript, cool, great. Glad to see them open sourcing things. And hope our friends over there get their stuff back up online pretty soon, because I'm sure a lot of people are having to work because they can't go to Facebook.
Yeah, and I did throw in some links to salsa.dev and the OSSF scorecard, because yes, I agree. Those are good actionable ways of how do you make recommendations that actually move the needle, to use the cliche of security. So check those out. Definitely, we're not trying to do some reputation laundering for our FB friends, but definitely highlighting some open source tools around SAST, or I'm going to pull in another article real quick near the end here, just about fuzzing. And there's an article here, it's more of an overview about what fuzzing is and how it can be helpful. It does have some links to additional tools. So it's a little bit more of why you should be using it rather than how to use it, just to put that in perspective. But it's a great way as you start to mature your development process. Bring fuzzing into it. I really want to push on that, because I think it can be a really effective tool if you have the people and budget to invest in doing so. But maybe one thing to wrap up on, we're talking right now, John, about developers care about security. Developers just need the tools, they need the support to be able to do security effectively, as well as prioritize it. But then there's always the basics that's going to come back and bite them. I'm not even talking about cross-site scripting this time. I'm talking about a root certificate that's expiring from Let's Encrypt. And again, this is not, Let's Encrypt is doing great work, not to pick on them, but just more of highlighting certificates expire. We actually know when they're going to expire. For those of you who want to dive in and do the mental ASN.1 parsing of an X509 certificate, just look for that expiration date. And it says, September 29th or whenever this one was. So we know that's coming in the future, but it still can be hard to keep track of, to remember, to plan for, as well as I think the bigger point I wanted to make, what happens when you have these long-term, long-lived certs, but you have longer-lived IoT devices, applications that aren't going to be easily updated, or maybe don't really have any ownership to update anymore, when all they need to continue working is one little cert update. So yeah, I guess I'm throwing that out there as the cautionary tale for our security side of the fence, to figure out what can we do to better help the developers here. So don't know, how do you think we should wrap this episode up, Mr. Kinsella?
Really quickly on that one, let's talk about availability of the CIA triad. From the point of view, as security people, we are to a point responsible for security. From an operational point of view, we should be monitoring